Amongst the many historic sites throughout Wyoming stands a 40-acre abandoned fort on the banks of the North Platte River near Sinclair in Carbon County. Fort Fred Steele was the third of three forts, including Fort D.A. Russell at Cheyenne and Fort Sanders at Laramie. These forts' primary purpose was to be used for repelling Native American attacks and acting as supply stations for workers and railroad construction. Colonel Richard Irving Dodge selected the site for the future fort. Colonel Dodge had a long career in the military himself, lasting from 1848 to 1891. He spent most of his post-Civil War career in the West, including command of Fort Dodge in Kansas. Fort Dodge was not founded by the colonel, but was founded by General Grenville Dodge. Fort Dodge and the accompanying town of Dodge City, Kansas, became infamous and home to some of the most famous characters in the West, including George Custer, Wyatt Earp, and Bat Masterson. The namesake for Fort Steele comes from Major General Frederick Steele. Major General Steele was a longtime veteran of the U.S. Army. He was a graduate of West Point in 1843 and served in several combat engagements in the Mexican-American War, earning awards for bravery throughout. After the war, he was stationed in the West, mostly in California and then the Nebraska and Kansas territories. The United States fell into a devastating civil war beginning in 1861. He fought in several large engagements, most notably during the Vicksburg Campaign. He was promoted to Major General in 1866 after the war, in response to his bravery and service from the Civil War. He was given command of the U.S. forces along the Rio Grande. Sadly, despite his valiant service and combat record, he died from injuries suffered during a buggy accident on January 12, 1868. He was honored with a statue at the Vicksburg National Military Park and the naming of the Wyoming fort outside of Sinclair. Fort Fred Steele was officially commissioned on June 18, 1868. It housed companies of the 2nd Cavalry and the 30th Infantry. Amongst functions as a military outpost and supply outpost, it was also a law enforcement arm as well. Carbon County was officially established on December 16, 1868. With Fort Fred Steele being commissioned 6 months prior, the need for organized law enforcement in the massive county territory was imperative. Shortly after it was established, it was visited by a who is who of American military personnel and dignitaries, including General U.S. Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, Phil Sheridan, and railroad magnates Thomas Durant and Sidney Dillon. Throughout the years, Fort Fred Steele dispatched soldiers to deal with labor disputes in Wyoming, even as far as Chicago. However, its most important task during this period was to be dispatched to skirmish with Plains Indians throughout the territory. In the late 1870s, Ute tribes were staging an uprising in northern Colorado and southern Wyoming. Conflict arose from a breach of treaty between the White River Ute tribe and the federal government and the state of Colorado. Originally, the treaty stated that land set aside for reservation would not be infringed. However, miners heading west began encroaching on the Ute lands in the 1870s. There was little the U.S. government did to honor the treaty and protect these lands from these encroachments. This was partially due to the condition of the U.S. Army at this point. Many were stretched over the vast territory, and parts of the 9th Cavalry, whose main objective was to patrol this region, were further south. This left little protection for migrants pushing westward and the Utes who were promised this land. Powder keg was lit in 1878 when Nathan Meeker was appointed the U.S. Indian agent of the White River Ute Indian Reservation. Meeker had little experience dealing with Indians, let alone the Utes in particular. Additionally, there was added pressure from newly elected Governor Frederick Pitkin, whose campaign slogan of "The Utes Must Go" did not put confidence into the Ute tribes occupying the reservations. As the simmering situation became untenable, the need for more troops was demanded. Meeker sent a request to Fort Steele, and Major Thomas Thornburg was detached with 153 soldiers. Thornburg was the overall commander of Fort Steele at the time. On the way to the White River Agency, Thornburg's troops were attacked and ambushed at Milk Creek. Thornburg was shot from his horse and killed. 13 others were killed and 44 were wounded in the engagement. Subsequently, the same day, Ute raiders attacked the agency and killed Nathan Meeker, as well as 10 others, and escaped with hostages, including members of Meeker's family. Thornburg had left behind his wife and 3 children at Fort Steele. The U.S. government did not take too kindly to the attacks by the White River Utes. They were removed from Colorado to a reservation in Utah in 1880. They were stripped of the 12 million acres they were promised in perpetuity by the previous treaty. The White River Utes stuck to their nomadic ways and continued to move throughout northern Colorado. Chief Jack, the leader of the White River tribe, was tracked down and killed in 1882. His killing pretty much ended any more hostilities with the White River Utes, and they were forced into Utah. The Southern Ute tribes that had not participated in these conflicts at the White River Agency in Milk Creek were still forced to a different location. They were forced to settle in the Ouray Reservation. Fort Steele was an instrumental piece in this entire saga, as well as its commander, Thomas Thornburg. The Ute Uprising is one of the most important events in Colorado history, and Carbon County's own Fort Steele played a pivotal role in this conflict. As the 1880s progressed, more and more native tribes were subdued. With their removal, Fort Steele was no longer necessary, and was decommissioned in August of 1886. As the military left Fort Steele behind, many of the former buildings were auctioned off for private enterprise, including its massive sawmill that was constructed in the 1880s on the eastern side of the fort. The site remained as an important hub for logging and lumber production. Additionally, it served as a major sheep herd hub by the Cosgriff brothers. In 1905 alone, almost 1 million pounds of wool were shipped out of Wyoming in one order from the Cosgriff herds. The buildings they used were former Fort Steele buildings. The sawmill was also purchased and floated timbers down the North Platte River. In 1909, 1.5 million timbers made their way down the North Platte River from Fort Steele. As modern transportation progressed and Highway 30 was built, many of the remaining buildings were recreated to be hotels, cafes, and gas stations for weary highway travelers. The Lincoln Highway was rerouted in 1939 away from Fort Steele, causing many of the businesses to close. After World War II and the death of the timber industry, the fort was finally abandoned as a viable location. The Wyoming state legislature designated Fort Fred Steele a state historic site in 1973. Over its 80 or so year existence, Fort Steele saw many different iterations. One can still visit this spectacular site. Just take exit 279 off I-80 and go north a little bit and wander the grounds of this historic place. Thank you for watching this video from the Carbon County Museum. If you enjoyed, please like, share, and subscribe to the Carbon County Museum's channel.